if you know anything about the second generation of competitive Pokemon, you know Snorlax is the best. That includes Ubers, by the way. That's not as well known, but it is the best there as well. So, if you don't know why that is, and you would like to hear me explain it in lengthy, gory detail, then the video, which is being shown on the screen right now, is linked in a pinned comment. But let's assume that you do know Snorlax is the best Pokemon in Gen 2. And that you know that every single GSC OU team must use Snorlax. So, then we will also contrast this against the idea that I put forth whenever I talk about tiering, usually when complaining about how bad Gen 5 OU is, and what tiering opinions are fallacious and stuff like that. So I will often say that it doesn't matter how much good a Pokemon does for a metagame if it is broken. And that is very, very true. And people will say, okay, nice idea. What about Gen 2 Snorlax? And that is the idea that I am here to discuss today as soon as this stupid ad is skipped. So, the idea of banning Snorlax is nothing new. Tournaments have been played with Lax banned many times. This thread talking with it's a serious discussion too, because it's easy to just brush it off as, oh, only scrubs would complain about Snorlax, but no, serious GSC players. I mean, in this thread from almost 10 years ago, then you had the most elite GSC players of the day and of the days before talking. Hey, look, there I am. Talking about what it would take for Lax to be banned, and then a tournament was run, and Laxless GSC tournaments were nothing new, and I will have this thread linked in that pinned comment as well if you want to do some browsing. But I am here to explain the general principles of why Snorlax is not banned in Gen 2. Snorlax's status as the best Pokemon in Gen 2 period raises a lot of questions, because when we think about GSC Ubers in general, then Celebi used to be in OU. People mention Ho-Oh being in OU all the time, and people say, well, why not? And why, if they're clearly not as broken as Snorlax, then why are they Uber, and why is Snorlax allowed to run wild? Some players have even proposed that Celebi and Ho-Oh be released into OU to slow down the metagame, because the more offensive metagame is not as skill rewarding in their opinion. And yes, for those who wonder, wait, you're talking about GSC being too offensive? Yes, actually, GSC is a much more offensive metagame than a stall metagame. For the last several years, and I have a video about that as well, which I've also linked in the pinned comment. Anyway, so people wonder, hey, this Snorlax is so clearly busted. Some players' opinions on what makes Snorlax truly over the edge, it varies. People used to say, oh, Lovely Kiss is what makes Snorlax too hard to deal with, and other people say, no, it's just Lax, period. And then other people say, oh, actually, we should target, hidden power on electrics, but that's a different discussion. So the point is, it's a mess of what should be done in GSC. And this does sound similar to Gen 5 OU, if you've ever followed the discourse around that. People say, oh, no, Latios is broken, Keldeo is broken. A lot of people have different opinions on what needs to be fixed, quote-unquote, in GSC. So some people want to ban Jinx, for example. And, there was a whole stink about Freeze Claws and Sleep Trap and a whole bunch of stuff years ago. So at least those things, like Freeze Claws and Sleep Trap, had a consensus around them, whereas the other things I'm mentioning are a lot more muddled, and there's a lot of noise, and it's not really anything concrete. What is undeniable is that Snorlax is the best, and that beating it is unreasonably hard, and the only thing that even slightly evens it out is the fact that you have your own Snorlax. This is clearly not a healthy situation for a metagame to be in, or an OU metagame at least, because Ubers is more flexible. So that brings up the question, why are we not just playing Ubers? Why even try to tier it if we're not going to be consistent? And the reason is, the idea of tiering Pokemon in general didn't come around until Generation 4. the idea of banning Pokemon before obviously goes back to Gen 1 because, it's pretty obvious, hey, this Mewtwo thing might be a little too strong for, fair play. And, while we're at it, Mew's not too healthy either, even though some people do think Mew and OU is relatively okay. But yeah, Mewtwo and Mew, those are obvious ones. They're the, most clearly overpowered Pokemon in the game, and they're legendary, which also helps. In those early days. And then in Gen 2 comes around. Okay, the cover legends are busted. Clearly, look at those stats. Look at the everything. Oh, Celebi. I mean, that too. And Mewtwo and Mew again, of course. How can we let that know you? And that's it. Very simple, very intuitive, very instinctive. Because the community back then was a lot smaller. Not less competitive. That I would contest with anyone. Because a lot of people say, oh, back then, nobody knew how to play. That is demonstrably untrue. But that's a separate discussion. But the idea of tiering is weird because, and even in Gen 3, where there's a lot of power creep, and then Celebi was actually banned briefly in Gen 3, which is funny to think about. But even then, there wasn't tiering. It wasn't like, hey guys, I think this Tyranitar Pokemon might be a little too overwhelming to deal with. There was nothing like that until Gen 4. And then, why in Gen 4? Because Gen 4 brought Wi-Fi battling and an explosion of interest in competitive Pokemon, because it's a lot easier to get into competitive Pokemon with the games themselves as opposed to having to find a relatively obscure simulator online. So that's when tiering, competitive Pokemon blew up online, and there was a lot more interest in it. It's like, hey, maybe there should be some community involvement in how these tiers are formed. But in those first 3 generations, the power level is so much lower than in Gen 4 and later on. And there's not really that much need to ban Pokemon because they're so much easier to play around. And you mark the difference between something like Gen 3 T-Tar and then Gen 4 Garchomp, which, by the way, seems like the most obvious ban ever, but that was an outrageous decision when that happened. So it took a while for the idea of tiering to even take off. So that's why Snorlax was never banned back in the day. I mean, people played without it in small tournaments, but it was never the standard. The standard is, look, you use Lax, and you get good by playing around it. And Gen 2, with its bulk and its focus on defense in those early days, and the fact that Snorlax is not invulnerable, as good as it is, means that a lot of being good at GSC is learning to play around it. Yes, it's going to do stupid stuff sometimes, but that's just how it is, because back then, that was just how the game was. It's the same reason why Tauros was never banned from serious RBY play or anything like that, because a lot of people ask, well, what about RBY Tauros? Isn't it the same thing? Yes, it is the same thing. But I'm here to tell you that it was a community thing. You get good by playing around it, because it's a lot easier to do that in these generations where everything has maxed out bulk stats, and there are tools to play around it more easily in these weaker metagames. So then you say, okay, fine, that was back then, this is now. We know that tiering is good for a metagame's health, and we shouldn't be afraid to mess with old metagames just because they're old. Because if they're still being played, then in our modern tournaments, then why shouldn't they be actively tiered, right? And that is a sentiment I absolutely 100% agree with. That's why I was such a proponent of Latias returning to DPP, for example, and so many other things across the last decade. Yeah, in general, I would agree with that. I'm not necessarily saying that we need to have monthly suspect tests or anything, but there's another ad. Yeah, so I'm not saying monthly suspect tests or anything like that, but I am saying that, look, if there's something to be done within reason, then it absolutely should be done. And the reason why Snorlax has not been, seriously considered for any sort of tiering action is that it falls out of that category of within reason. And why not? Well, it's clearly way more broken than anything else you could possibly care to name, right? Yeah. But this is, and again, this is where I have to say it is an exception. the general rule of you don't keep something broken around just because it does good for the metagame, that is absolutely true, but not in Gen 2 because it is an exception. And here's why. When I talked to Peng a couple months ago about what I would do with Gen 5 OU and his thoughts on, okay, that's a nice idea, but we have to be pragmatic about it. Then every time I said we should just throw everything out and start over, and he's like, yeah, okay, you don't have the player base for that. And Gen 2 is very much the same, because if you were to ban Snorlax in Gen 2, then you probably actually no, it's not a matter of probably. You will have to ban Zapdos after. Zapdos is already insanely busted with Snorlax around. Without every team coming with a built-in Snorlax thing, well, forget it. You are running... This is what has been the overwhelming conclusion every single time Snorlax-less GSC has been played. In case you want to go, skim through those threads and that tournament that that are in the pinned comment. The metagame, that stereotype about how GSC is all stall, which is very, very untrue, as I explained in that other video in the pinned comment. Yeah, without Snorlax around, it becomes true. It is Blissey everywhere, and when you run Blissey, you're running Skarmory, and you're running 16 other walls, and that is not a metagame anyone's going to want to play. And it's mostly a matter of Zapdos being, and special attackers in general, being insanely overwhelming when there's no all-around good fix, or no catch-all wall for it, as teams currently do have with Snorlax. I mean, Raiku's pretty good, but Raiku's good in conjunction with Snorlax, not doing the whole work itself. Because there's this move called Explosion, and all this other stuff. So, it's weak to spikes, and it has to rely on rest for recovery, and so teams are just going to get bulkier and bulkier, because what Snorlax does is, it allows you to withstand these special attackers without going full-on wall like Blissey, because Blissey will let you eat special attackers all day, but it's not threatening instant damage back. Snorlax lets you eat up these special attackers and actually go on the offensive. So, and number two, Snorlax is actually one of the best Pokemon for breaking stall teams. So, it is better for both offensive and defensive purposes. Without Snorlax, well, I won't repeat myself. If I'm unclear, please ask in a comment and I will answer. But that's the general idea. And now, again, modern standards applied, yes, Snorlax is gone. And if Zapdos is broken and forces the metagame into unhealthy states after, yes, absolutely, ban it. And then what happens? Well, okay, so first of all, hang on, gathering my thoughts so I'm not saying 16 things at once. You ban Snorlax, you ban Zapdos, that is unprecedented, okay? I mean, we have a general idea of what Laxless GSC would be, but no Lax, no Zapdos, that's... I mean, I'm sure it would be interesting. For sure. Absolutely. But look, if we couldn't even retest Celebi and Ho-Oh, who would be worse than Snorlax and would not destabilize the metagame at all, we certainly can't go the other way around with Lax and Zapdos. I mean, not because of the metagame... Well, if we had the player base too, then sure, why not? But... as it stands, maybe we get a better metagame out of it, and if we don't, you know what we can do? We can just undo it. We can just go back to the old GSC that we've known for so many years, right? But, it doesn't sound like such a bad idea, but that's why it hasn't been done before. I'm not saying that, I'm 100% opposed or anything like that. Like, we should try it and we shouldn't try it. No, we could, but realistically, the player base is just not there to make such a move feasible. And I don't think you would be drawing in more players to GSC by banning these two. Not on any level that's meaningful anyway. So, all in all, so as much as... because I do believe that whole thing I preach about something broken in the metagame, doesn't matter if it's good, but that's for metagames with more active player bases, more modern metagames, and metagames that we had the option to tier at the time and, messed up for some reason. Going back to Gen 5, of course. But in Gen 2, it was different back then, and it's different even now, and that's why it just is the Snorlax metagame generation, whatever. It is largely for the better. Now, if the GSC player base kicks up to the point where suddenly everyone's playing it nonstop for some reason, then, I mean, that would be cool. GSC is amazing. I would love if that were the case. But until that happens, then we're not getting these hyper idealistic suspect tests. And it also helps that the GSC metagame, even with super broken lax, is incredibly balanced. So, that's another contributing factor. Like, yeah, this is an insanely busted Pokemon, but the metagame overall is one of the best we have. And we know from the tournaments that have been run with it that that one's a lot worse. So, yes, that is the case. And I think that I've said everything I've needed to, or wanted to, or both say. So, check the pinned comments for further viewing, listening, reading, whatever. And we will just conclude by watching the remainder of this battle from a couple of years ago. Morning Sun Nidoking is a very cool set. Okay, there it is. So, thank you so much for watching. I hope this was of interest or use to you. And if you have any opinions or questions or whatever, then feel free to ask in the comments. Thank you for watching, and I will catch you next time.